Holocaust Handbooks, the world's leading book series critically exploring what the powers that be don't want examined. Mesmerizing comprehensive presentations such as lectures on the Holocaust, as well as cutting-edge research results such as The Real Case for Auschwitz. Read most of our books free of charge at holocausthandbooks.com, where you can also watch our riveting documentaries. All this high-quality content was made possible by viewers like you. Please consider making a donation to help us create more of this content. We cannot do it without you. Thank you.
I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program, continuing our series on the Holocaust of the Germans. Germany must perish. We talked about Eisenhower's death camps, detailed by a Canadian author, James Buck, in this book, Other Losses. The English-speaking publishing industry, heavily dominated by Jewish interests, that must be said, in all honesty, delights in printing all kinds of anti-German books, year in and year out. Here is the latest one, Hitler's Willing Executioners, by Assistant Professor Daniel Jonah Goldhagen at Harvard University. Now, the Goldhagen book is what made me decide to do this series, and so the program that you're about to hear is in response to this blanket accusation that Goldhagen, the Jewish professor, kind of hurls at the German nation, that the German nation is nothing but a nation of genocidal maniacs that knew nothing better to do in the Second World War than to run around, exterminate Jews at will. Well, it just ain't so. But since there's always two sides to a coin, I'm asking you to bear with me. I'm quoting to you from this book, an American book, not a German book. It's called Gruesome Harvest, The Costly Attempt to Exterminate the People of Germany by Ralph Franklin Keeling. First came out in 1947 by the Institute of American Economics. We have gone virtually from the beginning of this book, almost three-quarters through. I have skipped a number of chapters and am now at page 108, in which the author talks how finally, after many idiotic criminal policy moves by the people in Washington, in London, and in Paris, which led to the starvation of millions of Germans after the guns had fallen silent, and how the communists ran roughshod over American personnel, American military people, and policy administrators in Europe and so on, because the policies had basically been formulated by Washington-based communists. And later on in history, it'll be perfectly clear why these disastrous policies for Germany and for Europe came out of the United States. I mentioned in the previous program that I recently read a book called Special Tasks by a former Soviet general called Sudo Blatov. And he's the general of the KGB in charge of atomic espionage. And in that book he outlined the total penetration, infiltration of the United States atomic energy program by what has to be 85–90% Jewish communist spies. Where does Pseudo Plato live today? The man who wrung out of the United States with disloyal American Jews and aliens who worked on the American atomic program, wrung all these top secrets out of these people and out of the United States. He lives in California, untouched, He lives in California, enjoying the good life, even though he admits in this fat tome of a book how he was in charge of all kinds of murderous activities before and even during the time when he was also in charge of the atomic spying against the United States. He was one that was commanding these units behind the German front, where Soviet units would dress as Germans and go and murder and execute and roughly treat people and then blame it on the Germans. So anyways, this nice man, an American today, is living just north of Los Angeles. Let's turn to this book, The Gruesome Harvest, and he says, the West awakens. The West has been slow to recognize that the Russian ally is really not an ally at all, but a determined enemy, that behind the Kremlin's every move lurks a sinister, dangerous motive. Our own leaders were long caught under the influence of Mr. Roosevelt's great design, a strategy of trying to cure the Soviet leaders in their suspicions, animosity and hatred of the West by showing them and showering them with favors and kindness. While under the spell, we considered the truculent sons of Russia prodigals just returning to the family of nations, and felt it our duty to cater to their whims and eccentricities, to overlook their insults and stabs. We signed the Potsdam Declaration without suspecting that it was a Russian booby trap, that its vague, contradictory, undefined provisions and phrases could be applied by and yield advantage only to a Soviet Union which thrives on human misery. We shut our eyes to the vital difference between our way of life and Russian communism, because communists called their way democracy. We assumed it was somehow akin to our democracy, and we accepted in good faith Russia's wartime pretensions that she was finished with revolution both at home and abroad, that her aggressions were nothing more than moves to strengthen her essential security. We have had our clashes with the Russians both in and out of Germany, have endured slaps and humiliations such as Americans have never accepted before. We have permitted our telephone lines running through the Russian zone to our zone in Berlin to be tapped. We have even put up with a Russian refusal to supply our Berlin zone with fresh food. We have bowed to Russian refusal to permit us to double-track our single rail line into Berlin. We have had serious conflicts over newspaper censorship, control of radio outlets and programs, schools and school curricula, and a multitude of things both important and trivial, taking it all with a friendly smile when we had to yield to Soviet demands. But finally we began to realize that such tactics were impressing the Russians only as weakness, and to awaken to the menacing character of Soviet designs. Mildly at first, but with growing determination, we began to take a firmer stand and to demand that our own interests be given some attention. Our disillusionment was complete when Mr. Molotov at Paris finally showed his hand. We have been staggering to our senses ever since. We must hope that the awakening has come in time to prevent the Kremlin from absorbing the German Reich. In the struggle, we must recognize that Russia will have certain advantages apart from those gained by our attempt to apply the sadistic Potsdam decrees, including deep German resentment. The Russian bureaucracy, with its long experience in managing economic institutions and processes, has found it relatively simple to take over control of the German economy in its zone, and is fully prepared to extend the control over the rest of the Reich when opportunity presents itself. On the other hand, our own government, and especially our military forces, are notoriously incompetent in handling economic affairs. Conditions reached bottom early in the Russian zone, so that what change has come has been for the better. Whereas bad things are in our zone, they must be expected to become progressively worse. Germans will not fail to note that the contrast and to draw dangerous conclusions. As stated before, the former movement of Germans from the east to the west has already reversed. Thousands of disillusioned, discouraged Germans are crossing into the Russian zone, where they will enthusiastically prepare to help drive the hateful democracies out of Germany. We have numerous advantages, however, which, if handled properly, should prove decisive. German antipathy toward Russia and Bolshevism is deep-seated. In contrast, Germans have hitherto always admired us Americans and have imitated us in many ways, especially in economic techniques. Russia has also compromised herself in fundamental ways. She was behind the terrible expulsions of Germans from the lost territories and other places. She has been the instigator and chief beneficiary of the slave system, having taken from 3 to 4 times as many prisoners as all the Western powers together. Germans of all classes deeply resent the cruel and violent liquidation of the former upper and middle classes, especially because it was carried out by foreigners and communists whose patriotism is suspect. Our task is to formulate a new and just German peace program, one that will give effect to our basic ideals and convictions and lead Germany toward, not away from us and our way of life. But before we can take this step intelligently, we must first face certain basic facts, must disabuse our minds of certain gross misconceptions which have lowered us in German esteem and misled us into the present danger. And then this American author, way back in 1947, says, Facts we must face, Chapter 10. How we have played into Russia's hands. General Eisenhower told a press conference in London that the Russians like a laugh. Well, they might, in view of the way we have played into their hands and fallen for their subterfuges. Things have come to such a pass that we have seriously been told we must not criticize the Russians or their government. Yet those who said so have felt perfectly free to criticize everything American and have made no corresponding effort to stop Soviet blasts at us. In March 1945, GIs in Germany were actually placed under official orders not to make unflattering remarks about the Reds. Typical of our un-American efforts to throttle critics was the American military government censorship in April 1946, a letter by a Catholic bishop calling attention to Russian abuses of Germans through forced labor and expulsions. We prohibited the reading of the letter in churches because it might offend Russia. Social Democrats in other German political parties have not been allowed to criticize the Communist Party, lest Russia take offense. We must realize that there is something seriously wrong with nations as with people who cannot stand criticism, who try to place themselves beyond reproach, and that something is equally wrong with people who truckle to them. Russia deserves not only criticism but condemnation. Stalin in 1939 told the Communist Party of Russia it must beware of us, for we would send our armies, our spies, murderers and wreckers into the Soviet Union. The facts are that the Soviet Union has sent its spies, murderers and wreckers into this country as in all others, where they have infiltrated into our government, occupying hundreds of key positions, sitting in our inner councils, and even helping mold our foreign policy. Now remember, I am Ernst Zundel, the German, reading from an American book. And this man is confirming what I have said during a few previous programs, that the United States and the Western world were so infiltrated up to the highest echelons that the policies that were adopted against Germany in Europe, these idiotic, insane criminal policies that Roosevelt and Henry Morgenthau foisted on Churchill in Quebec, in the Quebec Conference in 1944, were partly, to a great extent, written and formulated by communist Jews in American service. The facts are that the Soviet Union has sent its spies, murderers and wreckers into this country, as in all others, where they have infiltrated into our government, occupying hundreds of key positions, sitting in our inner councils and even helping mold our foreign policy. Now listen, there have been enough studies conducted in the early 50s and by enough American writers. There have been enough confessions by disgruntled and disenchanted communists in the United States to spill the beans for all to know of how Marxism dominated the Roosevelt administration. And if today's generation of Americans does not appreciate that, well, that's too bloody bad. It just was that way. Because the next 50 years of American foreign policy, billions upon billions of American treasure wasted. America betrayed. Believe me. I remember driving through the West in the United States, reading this billboard, and this one billboard read, "America, repent or perish." That was in the early 60s. And all the disasters that have befallen America, from the Korean debacle to this disgusting Vietnam no-win war, were basically because America was infiltrated and betrayed from within. And so here's this writer in 1947 saying that finally some people are beginning to wake up, but yet there were all these people in high places. Back to the book, Gruesome Harvest, page 112, chapter 10. It must make the Russians chortle up their sleeves, the way we coddle these insidious fifth columnists. In contrast, the Reds shoot on suspicion anyone they catch in Russia who they think might represent outside influences. In the Canadian spy trial, it was established both by direct testimony and documentary proof that the dissolution of the Communist International was probably the greatest farce of the communists in recent years. End quote. That only the name was liquidated with the object of reassuring public opinion in the democratic countries. Actually, the Comintern exists and continues to work. Communist insiders were warned by their higher-ups with regard to Britain and the United States, quote, "Yesterday they were allies, today they are neighbors, tomorrow they will be our enemies." It was also brought out that in Russia there is a great deal of propaganda carried on by conversation of the propagandists, and even in the press. It is all done to train people to think they must fight another war, that maybe it will be our final war. Now, a quick note on these Canadian trials of communist spies. Igor Gusenko, a Russian cyber cleric at the Canadian Embassy, exposed deep penetration Soviet spies in Canada. Again, 90% of them were Jews. And of the 17 spy rings that he exposed, 17 communist spy rings that he actually told about the Canadian authorities, only one spy ring was dealt with. The other 17, presumably, were allowed to continue. Why? Because Canada too was so highly infiltrated at the highest echelons of our government that these well-placed communist spies, many of them Jewish, were protected. And I just simply ask you, why? But maybe Americans that have since learned about the Pollard affair are beginning to wake up to why. Back to the book. In Germany, we have permitted the Comintern to place its agents in the American military government and the local German government apparatus we have erected. Newspapermen in our zone tend to lean toward communism, mostly because the former anti-Nazi talent was first cleared for press work by German émigrés with leftist leanings hired by the American military government to do the screening. Now, what does that mean here, this word émigrés? Émigrés in the German context, to the greatest extent, means Jews who left Germany after 1933 for the United States, for England and the Western countries, and Soviet Russia, and then came back in the uniforms of those countries. One of them was Willy Brandt, the later Chancellor of Germany, who came back in the Norwegian officer's uniform. Another one was the East German spy chief, Wolf, who came back with his parents basically on Soviet tanks to East Germany. And so it was. The mayor of Hamburg was a Jew who had gone to the United States. And now recently, the chairman of the board of Mercedes-Benz was a Jew who had fled to Istanbul and came back. Oh yes, and cost the German bourgeoisie $35 billion in losses he racked up. So there is one guy who inflicted a little restitution on those Germans. Anyways, that's what it meant. And Judge Wennerstrom in the Nuremberg trials said in a press statement when he left for the United States in utter disgust that Nuremberg was dominated by aliens in American uniform. And what he meant was Jews who had fled Germany for the United States and had come back in the uniforms of the conquerors. And so here is this American writer saying that in Germany we have permitted the Comintern to place its agents in the American military government, the local German government apparatus. We have erected newspapermen in our zone tend to lean toward communism, mostly because former anti-Nazi talent was first cleared for press work by German, meaning Jewish, emigres with leftist leanings hired by the American military government to do the screening. Ask any of the American officers who were then in Europe. I've done a number of interviews with them, Americans and Croatians and other Europeans who were wise to the ethnicity problem, and the man is right on the money. And this has been the tragedy, by the way, of Germany, modern-day Germany. That's the reason why German politics have been left-leaning ever since 1945, and why National Socialism and nationalism in Germany have been basically dumped on since 1945, and why the German national character has been turned upside down, inside out, because of those commies and pro-communists and leftists that your American military government put in place to brainwash the Germans in 1945. In May 1946, it was revealed that the State Department, with the aid of the FBI, had purged itself of hundreds of pro-Soviet employees. Sometime later, Mr. Burns, head of the department, when asked why certain others had not been let out, despite their having been identified, replied that it would be inadvisable to do so while we are involved in a serious diplomatic struggle with the Soviet Union. Does that make sense to you? I don't think it makes sense to me. To leave pro-commies in the State Department because we are involved in a serious diplomatic struggle with the Soviet Union. Why leave commies in place in the State Department? It's another one of these stupid, insane answers given by soft-headed liberals. His excuse was a tacit admission that he recognized that the men are agents of the Soviet government and that the Kremlin might get upset if we turned the rotters out. There is no valid reason why we should treat Russia and her fifth column any differently from the way we treated Nazi Germany and its fifth column. The only important difference between the two in terms of their threat against our national tranquility and safety is that the Soviet fifth column is far stronger and more deeply entrenched than the Nazi one ever was. Read that book by Pseudo-Platov, and you will know exactly that this man is telling the truth of how America was infiltrated by these Jewish communists. Amazing. It is just like Lenin said, that the capitalists were going to fall like a rotten apple into their lap. If it was right for us to crack down on the Nazis here the way we did, without regard to Hitler's feelings, it is right that we should crack down with equal firmness and effectiveness on the communists in our midst, without regard to Stalin's feelings, for all of them would be potential traitors and saboteurs if we should get into serious trouble with Russia. One of the most costly consequences of Soviet penetration of our State Department has been our acceptance of wily Russian proposals at Yalta and Potsdam. These include division of Germany into zones, each to be occupied by a different power, the Allied Control Council with a clause calling for unanimity in all decisions, with all the disastrous results already noted, requiring Germany to pay reparations in kind, the forced labor system, the forcible expulsions of millions of Germans from lost German territories, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The territorial settlements and arrangements accepted at Potsdam were all the ones pressed by Russia. French claims were left open. The idea of a long armistice for Germany, if not of actual Russian origin, would certainly play into Russian hands. Britain and the United States in these days between Tehran and Potsdam, thanks in large measure to Mr. Roosevelt's unfortunate great design and red influences in the administration, were eager to borrow any Soviet idea and acclaim any Soviet plan for Germany. Let me read that again for you. Britain and the United States in the days between Tehran and Potsdam, thanks in large measure to Mr. Roosevelt's unfortunate great design and red influences, communist influences, in the administration were eager to borrow any Soviet idea and acclaim any Soviet plan for Germany. Although deeply involved in war, the brains of the Politburo found the time to frame a program to take full advantage of the Westerners' solicitude. They have been cashing in on it ever since, and we have been suffering the consequences. We have even given Russia help, both direct and indirect, in extending her power over Eastern Europe and half of Germany. Instead of following Churchill's advice of attacking Germany through the Balkans and thus warding off Russian conquest and occupation, we sided with Russia and decided to attack across the English Channel. As the Russians swept into the Balkans and on into Austria and Germany, they rode in American Lend-Lease trucks, jeeps and airplanes. Since then, we have supported their brutal rule through such agencies as UNRWA. As fast as we have shipped relief supplies into these areas, Russia has drained out an equivalent amount for herself and claims the credit for what we pour in. In Germany, we even handed the Russians our money plates and permitted them to print billions of occupation marks, which we were originally supposed to make good and possibly still are. But all such aid, including the $11 billion in Lend-Lease gifts, has been ignored by the Kremlin, which has gone blithely on its way, opposing our most vital interests. Let me repeat something Roosevelt said, Franklin Roosevelt. Things don't just happen that way. They are planned that way. Something as important as handing over the printing plates for occupation marks to the Russians so that they could inflate the currency and rob the Germans of billions and billions of dollars, which ultimately led to the collapse of Germany's economy and necessitated an entirely new currency for Germany when I was a kid, are clearly at the doorstep of American policymakers. Communist infiltrated, yes. Soft-headed, stupid, and criminal, yes. We should have known better. In addition to all this, as Dorothy Thompson has well expressed it, Mr. Morgenthau's fantastic concept led the basic principle for the Potsdam program, which played straight into Soviet hands. In other words, the Morgenthau plan was made to order for the Kremlin. When we came to Russia at Yalta with a so-called peace plan which called for vengeance and destruction of a trade competitor, she saw and seized her opportunity to turn the whole program to her advantage at our expense. Although the plan promised to bring the blessings of peace and prosperity to a troubled world, if we had only taken the trouble to analyze its proposal in the light of Mr. Morgenthau's own principles as expressed in other connections on other occasions, we should have recognized immediately that it could only bring catastrophe. In promoting acceptance of the Bretton Woods Fund and Bank Plan, Mr. Morgenthau, as Secretary of the Treasury, proclaimed the thesis that, quote, prosperity like peace is indivisible, end of quote. And in promoting the loan to Britain later on, he elaborated at length on this principle. These are his own words. Quote, if we have learned nothing else from the frightful experience of war, we should have learned that at least we did live in an incorrigibly integrated world. It is a world which cannot exist half slave and half free, nor half at war and half at peace. Neither can it exist half prosperous and half impoverished. Prosperity like peace is indivisible. It must be shared by all if any are to enjoy it. Our living standards cannot rise and remain at high levels without progressive prosperity throughout the world. As I have observed before, prosperity cannot be segmented. All must share in it, or in time all will lose. The contradiction between the tenets and the deliberate impoverishment of any nation is irreconcilable and obvious. Mr. Morgenthau advances these ideas as universal principles, applicable to all countries without exception. If they could validly be used to support making sacrifices to put one country, Britain, on its feet to bolster world trade and prosperity, with equal force they could compel the conclusion that a program calling for permanent impoverishment of any leading country, Germany, not accepted, would plunge the whole world into an economic quagmire. Mr. Morgenthau is not alone, however, in thus compromising himself with his own principles. Mr. Bernard Baruch, well-known advisor of presidents, has also been at one and the same time a one-worlder and an implacable advocate of converting Germany into a poorhouse. As the war was drawing to its close in the European theater, Mr. Baruch, who loves to address his audiences as fellow citizens of the world, was in London, where he granted an interview to A. Victor Lasky, a Stars and Stripes staff officer. In explaining his presence in the British capital, Baruch said, according to Lasky, "And one reason I'm over here is to hold a big stick over the big boys to make damn sure they're not going to foul up the peace. We've got to deindustrialize Germany and Japan for at least a generation to see that those subsidized slave labor countries do not again flood the world with their cheap products." This was Mr. Baruch's way of saying that he was abroad to see to it that Germany was permanently eliminated as a competitor in world trade. Baruch failed to explain the nature of the big stick he was holding over the big boys. But the following June, before the Senate Military Affairs Committee, he made very clear what he wanted done with the Reich. He said it was not enough merely to demand an economically weak Germany, that the program of weakening Germany must be sufficiently specific, industry by industry, so that all the occupying nations know they have agreed to the same thing. First of all, he said, reparations should be paid in German labor instead of rebuilding the country's industry so it could pay reparations through exports from current production. Germany's war-making potential must be eliminated. Many of her plants must be shifted east and west to friendly countries. All heavy industries destroyed, the Juncker estates broken up, her exports strictly controlled, German assets and business organizations all over the world rooted out. Now, I must add here, even though if it grates on you, the listener, and the viewer, Baruch is a Jew. He was once known as the king of the Jews. He was in charge of the War Production Board, I believe, already in the First World War. He was part of the kind of disastrous policy makings and these huge reparations demanded of the Weimar Republic after the Versailles Treaty. That was before Hitler. That was before Nazis. The Kaiser was pro-Jewish, surrounded by Jews. The German government was very much pro-Jewish under Kaiser Wilhelm II. So this is nothing to do with anti-Semitism of the Nazi kind. I am saying to you, it has something to do with anti-Germanism of the Jewish kind. Because what drove these people on to be so ruthless to those Germans when Hitler was not even known of or heard of? So what we are looking at here is Jewish anti-German hatred coming out for all to see. Now it is against allegedly Hitler and what Nazis did, but what was going on in 1920, 1919, 20, 21, 23, 25, 28 before Hitler ever formed a government, when it was never even known that he was ever going to amount to more than a little hick politician somewhere. I think the people of the world ought to ask themselves this question. Now let's get back to Mr. Baruch. This program of impoverishment and that of Mr. Morgenthau are of course very similar. They should be. They are both Jews. Mr. Baruch candidly admits that his aim is to destroy Germany as a trade competitor. Mr. Morgenthau's program tacitly contains the same objective. People were appalled when it was said that the elder Rockefeller burned down the refineries of competitors he could not otherwise destroy. How about that? The elder Rockefeller, well known in American history, burned down the refineries of competitors he could not otherwise destroy. How much more revolting are these proposals to destroy the economy of a whole nation for a similar purpose? Conservative leaders who use their influence in this manner furnish a basis for effective criticism of capitalistic morality or lack of it, and weaken the basis for defense of the profit system, since according to the one world thesis, prosperity must be shared by all, if any are to enjoy it, and all must share in it, or in time we all will lose it. The Morgenthau-Baruch plan would impoverish not only Germany, but Europe and the whole world, not excluding the United States, and therefore presumably Messrs. Baruch and Morgenthau as well. The Morgenthau-Baruch proposals have been the official policy of our government. An American writer, writing in 1947, in an American book, this book says that the Morgenthau, a Jew, Baruch, a Jew, proposals have been the official policies of our government, which at the same time is committed to one world principles. As a result, our leading officials, in their efforts to uphold these mutually exclusive theories, have been forced, like Mr. Morgenthau, into absurd self-contradiction. For example, Mr. Truman, while advocating impoverishment of Germany along Morgenthau-Baruch lines, said at Soldiers Field in Chicago, quote, "We shall work to achieve equal opportunity in world trade because closed economic blocks in Europe or any place in the world can only lead to impoverishment and isolation of people who inhabit it. We shall press for the elimination of artificial barriers to international navigation in order that no nation, by accident of geographic location, shall be denied unrestricted access to the seaports and international waterways." Later, he said in the same speech, "Economic distress anywhere in the world is a fertile breeding ground for violent political upheaval." Now, the problem with modern American presidents and Western German presidents and so on is that none of these guys write their own speeches. You know that. Remember when Nixon, Bush, and all these people were in the White House? All those speech writers that were writing speeches for them, sometimes half a dozen. And these presidents then get plunked something on the table, and God knows how shortly before they get up to speak, and then they just blab on what some scribbler has written down for them. Never thought it out, most likely. He's just a politician who's giving a speech somewhere on some occasion. That's the problem. But since these speeches affect millions of people, and in that case affected my country of 100 million Germans around the world in those days, and especially in Europe, we have every reason to speak up, squawk up, and to tell you, subsequent American generations, that we are still upset about it, and that we will not forget what was done to us and how you robbed us of our pride, our heritage, and our history. Let's get back to this book, Gruesome Harvest. By continuing our policy of creating economic distress in Germany, we would therefore create a fertile breeding ground for communism. Here Mr. Truman admits as much. In his speech in Stuttgart, Mr. Burns, who was then Secretary of State, contradicted himself in a similar fashion, for he tried to justify the original program of deindustrialization and denazification, which means holding Germany in poverty. And at the same time, he said, "We learned, whether we like it or not, that we live in one world from which we cannot isolate ourselves. We have learned that peace and well-being are indivisible. Before we can win the respect of the world and get on the right road leading to a real world prosperity, and well-being, we must eradicate the whole Morgenthau and Potsdam contamination from our thinking and official policies. And then this man continues and says, Germany is the heart of Europe. We must take seriously the recognized fact that Germany is the heart of Europe, on which the economic life of that continent depends, and that when we make that heart stop beating, all Europe must die. We must realize, too, that any reduction of the German standard of living would only lower the standards of other European countries, that to bring them all to the same mean level would bring universal impoverishment that would cancel out the progress of centuries. Despite his one world principles expressed elsewhere, Mr. Morgenthau in his book, Germany is Our Problem, writes, quote, actually, there is no European economy, certainly not in the sense that there is a United States economy. Some 30 countries in Europe have their separate economies, and a great variety of them too. He facetiously argues that a strong Europe is better than a strong Germany, as though the two were opposed, and insists that weakening Germany and reducing her foreign trade will add to European prosperity. He says before World War I, Germany accounted for 12% of the world's international commerce. By 1920s, her share had fallen below 10%. In 1936 and 37, it was a bit more than 8%. The world would not be a loser if Germany fell to 2 or 3%, or her share were taken over by other nations. In short, where Germany is concerned, Mr. Morgenthau finds foreign trade quite unimportant, either for the Reich or for the countries trading with her. However, when other countries are involved, foreign trade takes on unique importance. In a statement submitted to the Small Business Committee of the Senate, April 20th, 1945, Mr. Morgenthau said the following: our exports may seem to be only a small part of our total production. They are nevertheless vital. They mean the difference between prosperity and depression for both agriculture and industry. On February 26, 1945, he told the Detroit Economic Club, while urging building up our exports of automobiles to 1 million cars a year, we can reach such a trade level only if both the producing and consuming powers of all countries are expanded, not merely restored to their old levels. Such statements show that Mr. Morgenthau himself, if he will only think things through, must repudiate his proposals to impoverish the Reich and destroy its trade with the rest of the world, or give up one world principles. Britain's experience testifies eloquently to the importance of Germany to the European economy. At first she fell under the influence of those advocating German impoverishment, ostensibly to prevent another war, but actually to remove the Reich as a trade competitor, possibly turn it into a market for the very products it had formerly exported. But when she saw that Germany was facing complete disaster and pulling Europe down with her, she partly reversed her position to prevent what approximated closely to cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. For after all, she had to realize that the destruction of Germany to prevent German exports from competing with hers would also mean loss of a large German demand for British goods. As Prime Minister Attlee told the U.S. Congress, we cannot have prosperity at home with hell abroad. The German prostration has been felt everywhere. Sweden has officially expressed concern over the fact that she has been unable to carry on any of her accustomed trade with the Reich, with damaging consequences to herself as well as Germany. Holland too has been hard hit, having to export food and fuel while the homeland does without. Dutch farmers used to exchange food products for German fertilizer, which they can obtain now only at high prices from high-cost producers. Holland used to get fees for transmitting goods between Germany and other countries. Now this trade and its profit are gone with the suppression of German commerce. Germany and Holland used to exchange the things each made best in its own country. This put German machinery, tools, and instruments in Dutch plants, on Dutch farms and railroads. Now this equipment cannot be replaced or even repaired due to the stoppage of manufacture in the Reich. As one observer put it, the deindustrialization decrees have been encouraged by less efficient interests of the United Nations, especially England, which hoped to gain by the death sentence for German competition The Netherlands and other countries are missing what they used to get from Germany. In London, food ministers of 17 European countries, says an Associated Press dispatch, turned to defeated Germany as a possible source of coal and fertilizer, both sorely needed to avoid famine. Showing deep concern, the London Economist says, quote, "The truth is that the prosperity of Western Europe has depended to a great extent upon the existence of a great wealth-producing industrial concentration in the Ruhr. The wealth-producing machinery is now almost completely idle, and all of Germany's Western neighbors are bearing the consequences. To say that the ruin of Germany is the ruin of Europe would not raise in Russia more than a sigh of relief that both should be weakened together. The American attitude is more difficult to understand." Because it's not an American attitude, it is a Jewish attitude by Jews in American uniform and in American employ. Baruch and Morgenthau, with their double standard, their dual loyalty, their dual morality, basically screwed America. It's easy to understand. Once you take your blinkers off and your blindfold, the Chicago Sun editorially says, it is good business, plain hard-boiled common sense, for any wholesaler to help his best customer back on his feet when that customer is in financial difficulty. If the customer is a whole nation, the need becomes immensely more pressing. Of course, this was said in defense of a loan to Britain, but the same logic would apply as well to Germany, once one of our best customers. Mr. Burns said in Paris, "The economic revival of Germany is essential to the well-being of Europe." At Stuttgart, he admitted, as had Molotov at Paris, that Germany is the industrial workshop of Europe. To repeat, we are having to face the fact that we cannot continue with our original policies toward Germany and hope to have anything but impoverishment out of Germany, and as a consequence, out of Europe and the world. Now we come to the matter of war guilt. Mr. Morgenthau, whose ideas on the subject correspond to the official opinion of the United Nations, rests his entire case for turning Germany into a poorhouse on the thesis that German lust for war was the sole cause of both world wars. Desire for war, he writes in his book, has been firmly planted in the German as a desire for freedom in the American. Sheer will to war, accompanied by a plot to conquer the world, he says, has been intensely cultivated in the German people for nearly 200 years, and would probably require another 200 years to eradicate. Hence, he argues, the only way to stop Germany from again disturbing the peace of the world at her first opportunity is to prevent the opportunity, and this can be done best by permanently weakening her to a point where she cannot, even though she would, wage war. The justice of this whole program, and therefore of Potsdam, must stand for all on this premise. If there is any doubt as to its validity or completeness, there must be equal doubt as to the justice of his plan. Without attempting to exhaust the subject, we offer the following evidence, which does tend to raise doubt concerning the accuracy of the premise, and therefore equal doubt as to the justice of our treatment of the German people. Let us again consult Mr. Morgenthau. On other occasions, on March 7, 1945, he told the House Committee on Banking and Currency the following: "Power politics has become a term of reproach in the world. The United Nations hope to abolish it from the earth, but power economics may be just as dangerous, for if it is not the root of all evil in international affairs, it is at the very least a frequent cause of conflict. The legislation before this committee is our best hope of banishing that too. We cannot say that we will join the other nations in an organization to maintain peace, but will not help remove one of the most dangerous causes of war, economic dislocation." Economic dislocation is hardly the same thing as perversity of German nature or a will to war. 3 months later, Mr. Morgenthau told the Senate Banking and Currency Committee the following: "Peace is more than a political problem. It is a complicated structure that can be built only upon the solid foundations of economic order and prosperity in all countries. peace and prosperity are two sides of the same problem, we cannot neglect one without endangering the other. If peace is to endure, there would be jobs. There must be hope of economic betterment. International monetary and financial problems have been a source of conflict for generations. We must see that after this war, they do not become the basis for new conflicts. Lack of prosperity and hope for economic betterment and international monetary and financial problems were therefore at least partly to blame for the recent war, according to Mr. Morgenthau himself, not merely German lust for war, argued in his own book. He told the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce, after the last war, informal attempts were made to stabilize currencies, but they failed. Competitive currency depreciation led to other forms of economic warfare. New currency tricks restricted and burdened trade. They must certainly be counted on as a contributory cause of the Great Depression, and they were the first phase of the tragic war in which we are now engaged. Mr. Vinson, successor to Morgenthau as Secretary of the Treasury, gave this his version of the causes of war in these words. We have the political, social, economic problems among nations that twice in our generation rocked us into war. The resolution of these problems is necessary for prolonged prosperity and for a lasting peace. Solving such problems to prevent war is a far cry from our original policy of trying to maintain peace by turning Germany into a goat pasture. Herbert E. Gaston, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, in a published speech said, it was almost entirely because of the sick condition of foreign trade that we were barely getting out of the last depression when war came upon us. And on another occasion he said, it seemed apparent even before the present war began with Germany's assault on Poland that we could not have political peace without economic peace, and that economic peace and thriving world trade were not possible except under conditions of monetary peace. That most wars, including the last one, have been caused by economic disruption and consequent foul growths, to borrow a phrase from the late Lord Keynes, is truism which no informed person will deny. Such dislocations and their results are not the same as human beings. Human beings are the victims. Therefore, it is wrong to blame people for the forces which compel their behavior. When people fall into a trap where their existence is threatened, they will fight their way out if there is any possible way to do so. They will fight, even though it might appear suicidal to do so. For most people prefer to die fighting than to die supinely. Such behavior may be wrong, but it is the way people have behaved for many thousands of years, and the chances are they will continue to do so. Let me tell you, the Second World War was not for the Jews. It was not to save Jews from concentration camps. It was not about Adolf Hitler and his funny mustache. It wasn't about stormtroopers in the streets of Germany. It was about banking, about fortunes made out of armaments. It was an economic war. It was a war for markets by powerful interests. Little people were caught up on all sides of the conflict. I've been doing some research and I came across this book. It's called Germany Must Perish, by a Jewish writer and thinker, intellectual of the 30s and 40s, called Theodor Nathan Kaufman. And this book was widely circulated in the United States, was reviewed by Time magazine, who thought it was a sensational idea, Washington Post, New York Times, Philadelphia Record. And here is what this sensational idea was that Mr. Kaufman, the Jewish thinker, advanced. This dynamic volume outlines a comprehensive plan for the extinction of the German nation and the total eradication from the earth of all her people. 1941, copyrighted in the United States. Kaufman was important enough to write an obituary in the New York Times when he finally died. And it's interesting, if I, the German, or if the Germans under Adolf Hitler and Dr. Joseph Goebbels had promulgated such a plan, let me read it to you how it would have read. This dynamic volume outlines a comprehensive plan for the extinction of the Jewish nation and the total eradication from the earth of all her people, meaning of all the Jews. We would never hear the end of it. We would never hear the end of it. It is just like Elie Wiesel in his book, Legends of Our Time. Remember, Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Prize winner. He said that every Jew should keep a corner of hate, virile hate, a zone of hate, alive in his heart against the German, what the German was and what the German still is. You can read that paragraph in every book, Legends of Our Time. I bought every 6 months in Canada. I buy a book like that. Elie Wiesel is not embarrassed to appeal for hatred for every Jew, for the Germans, now, 1996. And so, finally, I have decided that we're going to examine this idea, who was really to blame in the Second World War for all the acrimony. So this book, 1941, we have here the Forrestal Diaries, former Secretary of the Navy, important American political leader, very important publisher, published this book, The Diaries of Forrestal, New York, Viking Press, and the book was in part serialized in the New York Herald Tribune and other newspapers, and an excerpt of it appeared in Life magazine, copyrighted 1951. And when you turn to page 121, the diary entry of the 27th of December 1945, meaning shortly after the war ended. And here he says that I played golf with Joe Kennedy, Joseph P. Kennedy, who was Roosevelt's ambassador to Great Britain in the years immediately before the war, and he was also the father of John Kennedy, the later president. And I asked him about his conversation with Roosevelt and Neville Chamberlain from 1938 on. He said Chamberlain's position in 1938 was that England had nothing with which to fight and that she could not risk going to war with Hitler. Kennedy's view was that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England if it had not been for Bullitt's, William C. Bullitt, then ambassador to France, urging on Roosevelt in the summer of 1939 that the Germans must be faced down about Poland. Neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause of war. You see what I mean? Very important testimony by the father of President Kennedy, saying that Chamberlain, the Premier of England, said that Hitler would have not gone to war with England or anybody else, but would have gone to the Soviet Union, destroyed Marxism, and he said he would not go on. Here's what he says, that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England. That was the view of the British Premier Chamberlain. And then he says that neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause of war. Again, the father of President Kennedy saying that neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause of war. And here comes a devastating admission. If it had not been for the constant needling from Washington, Bullitt said, kept telling Roosevelt that the Germans wouldn't fight, and Kennedy said that they would, and that they would overrun Europe. Chamberlain, the British Premier, remember? Chamberlain, he says, stated that America and the world's Jews had forced England into the war. Now you see, Hitler was hell-bent on destroying Marxism because Marxism, Bolshevism, this horrific monster to the east of Germany, with its tens of millions of victims caused by the Bolshevization, against which Winston Churchill had written eloquently already in 1919, 1920, and which the American government had been warned against by the People delegation in St. Petersburg and so on. The world knew the cutthroats that Stalin had assembled about himself. And so Hitler, being the closest country to this monster, powerful, you have to understand that the Soviet Union was more than twice as populous, vast resources in manpower and in war material. Hitler wanted to wrestle this thing down before it got out of hand. And the British Premier, in this book by James Forrestal, your Secretary of the Navy, and I think later on he was Secretary of the War, if I'm not mistaken, he said that the father of President Kennedy told him that the British Prime Minister said there would have been no war about Poland if it had not been for the constant needling from Washington, meaning from the Roosevelt administration, and the world's Jews, that the world's Jews had forced England into that war. So what is this about Hitler being responsible and the Germans being responsible for all the evil in the world? You see? One of the top men in American society, the father of President Kennedy, reporting from the British Prime Minister, told to us by none other than Forrestal, James Forrestal. And then there is this plan for the extermination of the German people by this Nathan Theodor Kaufmann. And then, of course, we come to the Morgenthau Plan. Kaufmann's plan for the total eradication of the German nation did not fly because too many Americans are too decent and less driven by hatred than obviously the Jewish thinker Nathan Kaufmann was. And so they kind of try to make it fly. It was discussed in the American media. Time magazine thought it was a sensational idea to eradicate the Germans through sterilization. Washington Post thought it was a provocative theory, interestingly presented. The New York Times, of all, said a plan for permanent peace amongst civilized nations. Now, can you imagine that? If a German newspaper had said that the extermination of all the Jews was a plan for permanent peace amongst civilized nations, wouldn't the world be up in arms? We would never hear the end of it. And yet the New York Times could say that about the extermination of the German people. So that's what I'm saying to you. That's the reason why we're doing these programs. And President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt and inherited that Morgenthau Plan, which was really only a watered-down version by another Jewish policymaker, namely Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury under Roosevelt, concocted this vicious plan that we have been discussing and outlining in previous programs, and to which we will come back in this program. And President Truman said that if they adopted the Morgenthau Plan for Germany, he said, such a program could starve Germany to death. That would have been an act of revenge, and too many peace treaties have been based on that spirit. And then the President of the United States, then Truman, said, I was never for the underdog, in turn becoming the top dog with complete power to act. When the underdog gets power, he too often turns out to be an even more brutal top dog. Wise words, believe me. But there were plans and attempts to exterminate the Germans at the end of the Second World War, not during the war was on. Maybe too many men were under arms and would have turned the rifles around against their own officers or generals if they had asked them to do it during the war. But after the war, the Germans lost the war after the war. And they lost it by these methods that we have outlined in previous programs, with this economic boycott, turning Germany into a goat pasture, deindustrializing Germany, because then they could not export and therefore could not feed their people. There were other people at work who had little plans to exterminate Germans. One of them was, maybe to your shock, Ike Eisenhower. Well, there's a Canadian author called James Back. He wrote a best-selling book about Eisenhower's death camps. It was called Other Losses. And he details how Ike so hated the Germans that he wanted to kill by starvation and neglect, by not giving them shelter, food, water, medical treatment, between 1 and 2 million Germans. That's what James Back says, the Canadian author. My own father was in one of those Eisenhower camps, and when he came home, he said that the treatment in those camps by the captors, and of course many of the people that were watching these German soldiers were then no longer Americans, but Poles and Ukrainians and East Europeans who had been stuck into Allied uniforms, regularly shooting their carbines and rifles at night into the camps, killing prisoners when they approached too close to the fence and so on. It was brutal. And to my shame, I have to say that I and my sisters never believed my dad when he told us these stories. I had to come to North America to find these books when my father was long dead, to find out that he, the German prisoner of war, had actually told us the truth. One book that finally decided and kind of tipped the scales for me, to do these programs, which I loathe to do because I'm an unabashed promoter of America. I think that the founding documents of the American Republic are second to none, inspired documents, in that America is the saving grace of Western civilization with its documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the kind of separation of the powers and so on. It's a sterling example, and I cannot understand why more people in the world haven't copied the American example. And so it pains me to be critical of America, but I must, because if we don't know history, we are bound to repeat its mistakes. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, in America, Harvard University professor, wrote this disgusting book, widely described, widely reviewed in America. It's called Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans and the Holocaust. The thesis of the book is basically that everybody in Germany knew, everybody wanted to kill Jews. Germany was really a nation of genocidal maniacs. Well, there are Jews, of course, who beg to differ. Here's another book. It's An Eye for an Eye, the untold story of Jewish revenge against Germans in 1945. The author is another Jew, John Sack. And in this book, and you will not find it in many bookstores, I guarantee you, I had to send somebody within 45 miles of the factory, the printing house that produced this book, to pick up a shipment for me and my friends so that I could discuss it on this program with you. And it's interesting what it says on the inside of the dust jacket, that in An Eye for an Eye is a riveting account of the appalling events that accompanied the end of World War II. In 1945, the Soviet Union, which occupied Poland and parts of Germany, a region inhabited by 10 million German civilians, established the Office of State Security and deliberately recruited survivors of the Holocaust to carry out a policy of denazification. The office entered German homes and rounded up German men, women and children, 99% of them non-combatant, innocent civilians, and took them to cellars, prisons, and 1,255 concentration camps, where inmates subsisted on starvation rations, where typhus ran rampant, and where torture was commonplace. In this brief period, between 60,000 and 80,000 Germans died in the office's custody. Now, it's interesting that one of the worst killers in this camp was a Jew. A Jew. A Jew who today lives peacefully in Israel. How do we know it? Because 60 Minutes, the famous 60 Minutes program on which I also have appeared, traced him, tried to interview him. John Sack was interviewed, the Jewish author of this book. So I'm saying to you, people who sit in glass houses should stop heaving rocks, because ultimately people like Ernst Zundel come along and they'll heave some back. And that's what I'm about to do. I'm going to quote to you from an American book called Gruesome Harvest, subtitled The Costly Attempt to Exterminate the People of Germany. The writer is Ralph Franklin Keeling, published in 1947 already by the Institute of American Economics. We have gone through this booklet of only 150 some pages, a book which I have had in my possession since the 60s. I have never used it in public, but I am now using it in public on these radio and TV programs because I am so disgusted by the continuing attack and vilification of German people and my heritage as a German and my father's generation that I thought that America, Canada, England, any English speaker in the world within the sound of my voice should hear what was done in your name and in your father's and grandfather's name. And if the Germans bear forever the guilt of what was allegedly done by their leaders, then I'm saying to you, in their policies, then I'm saying to you, we have every right as Germans to ask that you look at the policies that your countries were involved in and that you also make amends. That you get off our backs as Germans and that you help us restore our honor and our good name. We don't deserve the bad press and the vilification. German people are as decent as everybody else and as hard-working. And you people have no right to kick us collectively while we are down. My father's generation were honorable people, men and women. The men fought hard to free Europe from Marxism, sacrificed their lives, their treasure, their reputation, their health, to wrestle down what President Reagan called the evil empire in the East. And they nearly did it. And they would have done it if it hadn't been for the stupid, criminal policies of your governments. That's what they were. Americans have been very swift, always, to blanketly criticize the German nation and its policies and its leaders. Well, here comes the volley back. Your government's insane, stupid, and criminal policies defeated Hitler and the German army. And what you brought back into Europe and around the world, into Africa, Malaysia, and all the other third world countries, were global Marxist movements, because now Marxism expanded unchecked. And if I was a cynical man, I would say the infiltration of American, Canadian, and British and Australian society from the bottom to the top, your institutions of learning, your think tanks, your armies, your broadcasters, and so on, by Marxists to this day, serves you right. Your whole society, your whole culture, everything was turned inside out. And what is going on in Western civilization today, the decline, the drugs, the crime, the violence, the degeneracy, nose rings, earrings, colored hair, spiked hair, naked, topless, AIDS, all that is a direct result of your government's stupid, insane policies. Believe me. Because what we have today is what the forces that the Germans fought against were all about. You see, ignorance is no protection. And the arrogant ignorance that the nations of the Allied world and their intellectuals and leaders have displayed since 1945 has consequences. Actions and words do have consequences. So all the mess, the cesspool that most of our countries have become today, the uncertainty, the insecurity, the reason why you are barricading yourself into your apartments and homes and houses and burglar alarms in your cars and everywhere else, all that, the huge influxes of strangers and foreigners into your midst, all that was planned. All that was planned. There was the Hutton plan for Germany, figured out by some perverts in American institutions of higher learning in 1942, 43, 44, that said that they shall break the will of the German nation by colored troops being stationed in Germany and by allowing third world immigration? Well, that's what is happening in Europe today. And so, actions have consequences. At least the German nation fought. And let me connect to the last week's program. And here is what the writer of this book, Gruesome Harvest, an American book, said. Most wars, including the last one, have been caused by economic disruption and consequent foul growths. To borrow a phrase from the late Lord Keynes, is a truism which no informed person will deny. Such dislocations and their results are not the same as human beings. Human beings are the victims. Therefore, it is wrong to blame people for the forces which compel their behavior. When people fall into a trap where their very existence is threatened, they will fight their way out if there is any possibility to do so. They will fight even though it might appear suicidal to do so. For most people prefer to die fighting than to die supinely. Such behavior may be wrong, but it is the way people have behaved for many thousands of years, and the chances are they will continue to do so. The German nation fought with this primordial, inner understanding that in the East there was this monster that was building, and by some preemptive strike, collectively, the Germans were going to take it out before it could do them harm. And they nearly did, because they wanted to live, not to die and quiver and shrink away. They nearly made it. The British themselves have often found conditions during peace more unbearable than war. Whenever the balance of power is upset in Europe, so that the continent starts to fall under the domination of one of its powers, Britain considers the situation a threat to her very existence and goes to war to preserve itself. One of the best and most authoritative analyses of the matter appeared in the September 1943 issue of the semi-official British publication, quote, The 19th Century and After, by the editor, Mr. F.A. Voigt, V-O-I-G-H-T. The following are pertinent excerpts. It is fashionable to dismiss the balance of power as an obsolete doctrine. It is not a doctrine. It is for Great Britain and the Empire to immutable conditions of survival. Any power that becomes undisputed master of the European mainland can become master of the British Isles. England has no one permanent foe in Europe, and none of her vital interests conflict with the vital interests of any European power. Her only foe is that power, or that coalition of powers, which may endeavor to dominate Europe. Against that foe she must always be ready, always be strong, and always have allies. As her foe varies, so her allies must vary. The foe of yesterday may well be the ally of tomorrow, and the ally of yesterday may well be the foe of tomorrow. The power of the British Empire, plus the power of the continental allies, will, if the empire is strong, always balance the powers of whatever power seeks domination. And as long as the balance is maintained, there will be peace, for no one power can prevail over the rest of Europe, plus the British Empire, as long as the empire is strong. This simple mechanism is the balance of power. It exists by virtue of the immutable physical realities. Neither the League of Nations, nor any system of collective security, nor disarmament can change these realities. As soon as the balance of power is challenged, every collective system will collapse, and England will, if she is not to perish, make a counter-challenge. She did so in 1939. The mechanism of the balance was released, and the League of Nations was at once deprived of whatever reality it had ever possessed on the 1st September in that year, on the day when Germany attacked Poland, and so, releasing the mechanisms, began the Second World War. England fought to preserve the balance for that reason and no other. The commonly accepted view that Germany made war to dominate the world is, in our opinion, mistaken. She wanted to be a world power, but world power and world domination are not the same thing. England is a world power, but she does not dominate the world. Hitler would have been glad to share the world with the English. Had the English remained neutral, he would have been successful, but she would then have had been at his mercy, or the mercy of his successor. In any case, the mercy of the German nation. Nothing could have saved England from destruction except the goodwill of the Germans. It was to avert this fate for England that England went to war in 1939. It is to avert a similar fate in future years that the balance must always be maintained. The political complexion of those that maintain the balance is quite irrelevant. The nature of the peace must be determined by enduring realities of the European situation, not by transient phenomena like fascism, National Socialism, socialism, or communism. So you see, it wasn't the fault of the Germans. Well, the German nation hasn't fired a shot in anger since 1945, and there have been, by now, it's 170 different wars, revolutions, upheavals, civil wars, and so on. Germans had no hand in one of them. The Germans fired at one another over the border, brother against brother, over the borders artificially created by this terrific war. And of course the Germans have been accused, and Hitler especially, of wanting world conquest. World conquest. Hitler was out to conquer the world. And in the last program we talked about the British balance of power policy, and how England has always gone after continental powers that were a threat to her existence. Meaning, if England can't dominate Europe, then she is like a kid taking her marbles out of the sandbox and says, well, okay, if I can't dominate it, then nobody will. And so they cut down one continental power after the other, whether they be Austrian, Napoleon, the Soviets, Adolf Hitler, makes no difference. And finally, most people are beginning to understand all the virulence reserved for Adolf Hitler in the wartime propaganda means nothing. Because in 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18, Germany was governed by an elite of aristocrats who were virtually brothers and sisters of the British. And we were brother nations. And yet British propaganda was so powerful and made such a horrific kind of impact on the world with its stories about the Belgian babies with their hands chopped off and the nurses impaled on German bayonets and the machine gunning of prisoners outside Red Cross trucks and so on. All this was, and the cadaver factories making soap from human bodies. All this was already around in the First World War. There was no Adolf Hitler. There was no anti-Jewish policy. It was as virulent and vicious a propaganda in World War I as it was in World War II, and as it has been since World War II for this half century. And so if you really think about it, why is this? Why would this world power, England, want to so turn on this German nation in the last 75 years? Well, let me give you an article which appeared in September 1943 in the semi-official British publication, The 19th Century and After, by its editor, Mr. F.A. Voigt. I'm going to quickly read through it again. We covered it one more time previously, but I think it is important and essential that especially non-British readers understand what is the underlying, the essence of this problem, why war always was fomented, in this case especially against the Germans. And he says in 1943 already that it is kind of fashionable to dismiss the balance of power as an obsolete doctrine. It is not a doctrine. It is for Great Britain and the Empire the immutable condition of survival. Any power that becomes undisputed master of the European mainland can become master of the British Isles. England has no one permanent foe in Europe, and none of her vital interests conflict with the vital interests of any other European power. Her only foe is that power or that coalition of powers which may endeavor to dominate Europe. Against that foe she must always be ready and always be strong and always have allies. As her foe varies, So her allies must vary. The foe of yesterday may be the ally of tomorrow, and the ally of yesterday may be the foe of tomorrow. Now, let me just pause here. This is exactly what has happened. You see, the Soviet Union was an ally of the British, taken to the bosom of the British Empire. They had all these rallies with hammer and sickles and so on, flapping in the wind in England during the Second World War. No sooner had the German foe, which had been dominating Europe, been killed. Churchill said, "We killed the wrong pig," started the wrong pig, meaning the Germans. And then the Soviets became the enemy of England. And they went to spy and basically went into a Cold War against that foe. You have to keep that in mind when people talk about this monsters, Adolf Hitler and his regime trying out for world conquest and all this poppycock. Here is a British intellectual, semi-official magazine editor saying it in 1943 better than I could. And that's the reason why I rely on Allied sources, thinking people have always known this stuff. Let me continue. The power of the British Empire plus the power of the Continental Allies will, if the empire is strong, always balance the power of whatever power seeks domination. And as long as the balance is maintained, there will be peace, for no one power can prevail over the rest of Europe, plus the British Empire, as long as the empire is strong. This simple mechanism is the balance of power. It exists by virtue of the immutable physical realities. Neither the League of Nations nor any system of collective security nor disarmament can change these realities. As soon as the balance of power is challenged, every collective system will collapse, and England will, if she is not to perish, make the counter-challenge. She did so in 1939. The mechanism of the balance was released, and the League of Nations was at once deprived of whatever reality it had ever possessed on the 1st of September in that year, on the day when Germany attacked Poland, and so releasing the mechanisms began the Second World War. England fought to preserve the balance for that reason and no other. Not for the Jews, not for freedom, for the balance of power. The economic rulers, the elite of England, has always sacrificed any number of European peoples to their pipe dream, because they wanted to be top dog. The commonly accepted view that Germany made war to dominate the world is, in our opinion, mistaken, says this editor of a British magazine in 1943, in the middle of the war. Let me repeat it. The commonly accepted view that Germany made war to dominate the world is, in our opinion, mistaken. She wanted to be a world power, but world power and world domination are not the same thing. England is a world power, but she does not dominate the world. Hitler would have been glad to share the world with England. Had England remained neutral, he would have been successful. But she would then have been at his mercy, or the mercy of his successor. In any case, at the mercy of the German nation. Nothing could have saved England from destruction, except the goodwill of the Germans. It was to avert this fate that England went to war in 1939. It is to avert a similar fate in the future years that the balance must always be maintained. The political complexion of those that maintain the balance is quite irrelevant. Callously put, British editor, 1943, callously put, for all the world to see in black and white. The political complexion of those that maintain the balance is quite irrelevant. So all those people in Germany, in Holland, in Belgium, in France who were bombed into smithereens, lost their lives, their property, their eyes, their legs, their children, were sacrificed by a callous British elite playing power politics. Not Hitler. Made no difference. The Jews, they were totally irrelevant. The British didn't give a damn for the Jews. Believe me, the Americans couldn't care less. Turned them even away from America. Cuba? Pah, disgusting. Officials who had been bribed pocketed the money, and the Jews were left to their fate. That's the way it was. And so, let's continue. The political complexion of those that maintain the balance is quite irrelevant. The nature of the peace must be determined by the enduring realities of the European situation, not by transient phenomena like fascism, National Socialism, socialism, or communism. The exorbitant strength of Germany must be reduced, and it must be kept reduced. Better a despotically governed Germany that is not too strong than a liberal Germany that is too strong. But it is important that the weakening of Germany be relative rather than absolute. Now this was written, British policy, September 1943. The war was still raging. And guess what? That is exactly what you can observe again. When the war finally ended, the British were after deindustrializing Germany. They loved the Morgenthau Plan by then. At first, Churchill balked at it, but finally they realized, geez, if we send 500 factories out of Germany, these are all our competitors, we can keep the Germans down, and we can have more tea breaks and don't have to work as hard and turn out shoddy goods on the world market, and there won't be a pesky German competitor there to kind of steal our market. Because ultimately, if you really think about it, that's exactly what it boils down to. They wanted to have the status quo in England, their cushy positions. And of course, the forces behind this British elite that was so comfortably and has been since Cromwell's time been kind of grafted onto the British politic were the Jews, as we have heard out of this book by James Forrestal when he quotes the father of President Kennedy, and he says that Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, says, and he stated that America and the world's Jews had forced England into the war, that neither the French nor the British would have made Poland the cause of war. So you see, there is this confluence of interest between Jewish interests, British power elite interests, who gets shot, maimed, killed, hurt, ruined? Little people. Little people. Not only in Germany, in England too. England had almost 500,000 casualties. Of course, pales into insignificance to what the Germans had with their 10 million losses. But then, of course, England always thought that the Germany that was so strong had to be reduced. And you see, they kept that Germany reduced with the Cold War. With the Cold War. Germany was cut in 4. And so Austria was cut off. They had a little state of their own. East Germany was allowed to remain a state. The rest of the land was stolen from the Germans. The population is driven out. And so we ultimately then had, in post-war Europe, 3 German states. That was balance of power. The Brits could play one against the other, and it was fine. Because West Germany was only 56, 60 million. Not 100 million the way it was before the war. And certainly not 80 million the way it is now again. And so when you see the forces at work, when reunification was finally forced upon the Germans and the world, between East and West Germany, or Central Germany and West Germany, the Brits were right in there, together with the French, still trying to salvage their old order in Europe. But the power from beneath, the will of the German people for reunification was so strong that all they got was German traitors and German quislings doing their bidding and continuing to be keeping Germany down. And there was an article in an American magazine called The Plain Truth, and they said that the post-war structures created for Europe, especially kind of reunification of Germany, the reintegration of Germany into the West European Economic Union and so on, and NATO was not to keep the Russians out so much. This American writer said, NATO was created to keep the Germans down, to keep the Russians out, and to keep the Americans in. He forgot to mention control. So those interests in the United States and in Britain, they like this post-war arrangement. And so today, when Germany is this juggernaut of a rebuilt economy, reunified, you see, when Central Germany, mistakenly called East Germany, was allowed to join West Germany, I said to my friends, you can weaken a nation. You can weaken a nation by allowing what happened in this reunification. The Germans have been neutralized for the next 50 years by what happened with reunification, because they inherited this East German Communist Republic that was sucked dry of everything. Infrastructure was shot completely. And you know, I'll make a prediction for you. The British, the American power politicians and the Jews behind them have managed to balance the power in Europe once again. The Germans are looking inwardly. Huge amounts of money is borrowed. They're bogged down with interest payments. The Germans are floundering. Reunification was a huge drain on the German coffers. They have not recovered. They will not recover from that. If you look at the unemployment in East Germany, it's staggering. And you know, when the Germans finally have dug themselves out with hard work and all this in another 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and they get a handle on the whole situation, I make a prediction for you. If there is another war, these forces that have bogged down Europe in turmoil over turmoil, they will say to the Germans, oh, you're going to get your Polish territory back. Finally, they'll find somebody. They say that the Sudetenland, of course, it belongs to you. Naturally, it does belong to the Germans. The Jews can return to Palestine 2,000 years after the birth of Christ and claim, on some spurious claim, that they belong there because they came from there. Ridiculous. Even though 80%, 82% are converts to Judaism, Khazars. So if they can lay claim to Israel, why can't the Germans lay claim to Sudetenland, Silesia, Upper Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia, and so on? And you know, I'll make a prediction for you. In another 15, 20 years, the Soviet Union in Europe, America will by that time be in such a quagmire with internal race problems, revolutions, decadence, decline. In Europe, the Germans and the Russians, with some form or another, will once again look at one another. The Russians will say, oh my God, our country is still not what it's supposed to be, and so on, and so they will make the Germans an offer. You can have your territory back. East Prussia, take it. Do the Russians need it? Listen, the Russians don't need that land. They've got so much land they don't know what to do with it. Do the Russians care about Poland? They never cared about Poland. When it was opportune, they invaded them, cut them, sliced them. You know it, I know it, history records it. The Germans, they'll get that dream fulfilled, that they will be allowed to go back to where the bones of their ancestors lie buried, in Silesia, in Pomerania. Land that the Germans turned from swamps into productive agricultural land. Lebensraum. Lebensraum. And the Russians will gladly hand it over to the Germans, and the Czechs and the Slovaks by that time will hand over, make some arrangements with the Germans. And the Germans will be once again handcuffed by rebuilding the infrastructure of those lands that have been stolen, then not for 50 years like they were in East Germany, but maybe another, maybe for 75 years. And so this dynamism still inherent in the German nation then will be once again handcuffed, channeled, and the British and the American power politicians will rub their hands in glee, and they will congratulate themselves in their country clubs and in their Freemasonic lodges and say, big job, well done. Do they care about little people? They're maimed, their arms lost, their life savings ruined, great cultural treasures destroyed like in Dresden, Hamburg, Kassel, Frankfurt, Coventry, Rotterdam. They don't care. Power, money, influence, prestige. That's what they thrive on. Little people in England, Holland, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Russia, they are just like little figures on the chessboard for the powerful. And I'm making these programs in the hope that enough Americans, Canadians, Australians, English speakers around the world will listen to this and say, my God, we didn't think about this. Let's think about this. And today's methods will free us. Now, let's go and look a little more at the power politics of Europe and what divided Europe and what created the havoc. Go back to this book, Gruesome Harvest, page 123, and he says, this explains this British power politics, this balance of power policy. This explains in terms very different from Mr. Morgenthau's the underlying cause of the two world wars. It explains Britain's interest in the Potsdam Agreement, including the deindustrialization and denazification, and the exigencies behind Britain's present opposition to Russia, which again threatens to upset European balance, but just as Germany did. It disputes the thesis that the German people and their perversities were solely responsible for the war and should be punished accordingly. It also clarifies a good many otherwise unexplainable episodes connected with the war and its outbreak. I want you to pay attention to this. This is so important. It always has grated on me. This American writer, Ralph Keeling, in this book, Gruesome Harvest, explains it just like that. If you want to make sense out of the seemingly hopeless mess of the Second World War, why it happened and what happened after and so on, here comes some clarification. Utterly simple. Here's what he says. It also clarifies a good many otherwise unexplainable episodes connected with the war and its outbreak. So it was balance of power policy in England and in the Western world. Here it is explained. It shows why Britain went to war ostensibly to oppose aggression, but applied the policy only to Germany and not to Russia. When Russia attacked Poland in full partnership with Germany. It explains the reason for the secret protocol attached to her declaration guaranteeing British and French aid to Poland, which qualified and limited the guarantee to German aggression and none other. Most of you people undoubtedly still don't know that there was this secret addendum to this treaty between Poland and France, Poland and England especially, that said, if Poland should be attacked by Germany, meaning a foreign power, but by Germany, the secret addendum, then England will come to your aid. And the secret addendum did not mention Russia, and so when Russia attacked Poland, nothing happened to the Russians. England, with all the callousness of power politics, even though they moralize, oozing morality from every corner of their propagandists' mouths, did nothing. When Stalin marched into Poland, England didn't lift a finger. Not when they were the allies of Hitler, and not after, when they were the allies of England. Do you understand the utter callousness of these people and this policy? So the balance of power meant and explains that this is the reason for the secret policy attached to the declaration guaranteeing British and French aid to Poland, which qualified and limited the guarantee to German aggression and none other. The portion of this treaty was made public at the time, gave the impression that the guarantee stood on moral ground against any and all aggression. The published part stated, not that secret addendum, the published part stated, should one of the contracting powers become engaged in hostilities with a European power in consequence of aggression by the latter against the contracting party, the other contracting party will at once give the contracting power engaged in hostilities all the support and assistance in its power. And so the writer says, although the language is somewhat involved, the meaning is clear. that defense against aggression was the prime consideration and what England would fight for. The German attack against Poland was considered a high international wrong. But when Russia also attacked and Britain failed to oppose this aggression, which was also a brutal stab in the back, but continued the war against Germany alone, it became clear to many observers that something more was present in the situation than readily met the eye. There was a secret rider attached to the treaty, which has since been made public and which stipulates that the expression "a European power" employed in the agreement is to be understood as Germany. That's the secret. The expression "a European power" employed in the agreement is to be understood as Germany. This is why England did not go to war against Russia, not at the outbreak of the war, and later made Russia an ally. The idea was to trap the Germans and to basically do what Churchill called kill the pig. The crime of the Germans? They were too virile, worked too hard. They became a threat to the British oligarchy who wants to remain in power forever. I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program coming to you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada.